In the unforgiving heart of the American West, where survival is a daily war, one woman's stand against a band of ruthless outlaws becomes a legend whispered on the prairie wind. This isn't just a tale of a lonely widow with a shotgun. It's a story of grit, grief, and a ghost from the past. When a blood-soaked stranger collapses on her doorstep and utters a single impossible word, "Ma," a lifetime of secrets unravels. What happened in that isolated cabin would ignite a firestorm of revenge, revealing a conspiracy that reached the highest echelons of power in the Montana Territory. The dust of the Montana Territory in 1887 was a character in itself. It was a fine, pervasive powder that coated the lungs, ghosted across the sun-bleached plains, and settled in the lines of a face telling the story of a life etched by hardship. For Esther Hayes, the dust was a constant companion, a gritty reminder of the 10 years she had wrestled this land into submission since leaving the civilized green of Ohio with her husband, Josiah. Now it was just her. The dust, the endless ski, and the silence of a grief so profound it had its own heartbeat. Her cabin, a sturdy structure of lodgepole pine that Josiah had raised with his own 2 hands, stood as a solitary sentinel in the vast emptiness. It was her fortress and her prison. From its porch, Esther could see for miles in every direction a terrifyingly beautiful panorama of waving grasslands, distant toothy mountains, and the shimmering illusion of water that danced on the horizon. This unforgiving vista was both her protector and her greatest threat. It offered no place for an enemy to hide, but it also offered no place for her to run. The day had begun like any other since Josiah's passing 6 months prior, a ritual of survival. She had tended to her meager vegetable patch, coaxing life from the stubborn soil, mended a tear in Josiah's old canvas jacket that she now wore, and cleaned the double-barreled shotgun he had insisted she learn to use. "A woman alone is a target, Esther," he'd said, his voice a low rumble of concern. "But a woman with a shotgun is a negotiation." It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow, fiery descent, when the negotiation began. They came from the east, 6 riders materializing from the heat haze like wraiths. They weren't cowboys or prospectors. Their movements were too predatory, their silhouettes hunched and menacing against the bruised purple sky. Esther's heart, a slow, steady drum of sorrow, kicked into a frantic, panicked rhythm. She had seen men like this before, passing through their eyes, lingering on her small homestead with a covetous gleam. These were the wolves of the plains, the carrion birds who preyed on the weak. Her hands, rough and calloused from a decade of frontier life, did not tremble as she reached for the shotgun resting on its pegs by the door. She moved with an economy of motion, born of necessity. Her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her resolve a shield of iron. She slipped 2 brass shells into the breech, the click of the mechanism echoing the hardening of her own heart. She was no longer just Esther, the grieving widow. She was the protector of this last, sacred piece of her life with Josiah. She stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun held loosely at her side, its twin barrels pointing towards the ground. She knew better than to show her hand too early. Let them think her a foolish, defenseless woman. Let them underestimate her. It would be their final mistake. The riders slowed their approach, fanning out in a semicircle, their horses kicking up plumes of the ever-present dust. The man in the lead, a hulking brute with a tangle of greasy black hair and a scar that puckered his left cheek into a permanent sneer, dismounted. His name, she would later learn, was Jedediah Kane, a man whose cruelty was as vast as the territory he terrorized. "Evening, ma'am," he called out, his voice a gravelly mockery of politeness. "Quite a spread you got here. Awfully lonely for a fine woman like yourself." Esther remained silent, her eyes the colour of a stormy sky fixed on him. She let the silence stretch, letting it become a weapon. She had learned from Josiah that in the West the man who spoke first often lost. Cain's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "We're just weary travellers, ma'am. Looking for some water for our horses, maybe a bite to eat. We can pay." He patted a dusty saddlebag, the gesture meant to be reassuring, but it only amplified the sense of dread coiling in Esther's gut. "I ain't got much to spare," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror that was screaming inside her head. "And what I have, I need. The nearest town is Blackwood Creek. You can find what you need there." Another rider, a wiry man with shifty eyes, laughed. "Blackwood Creek is a 2-day ride. We're thirsty now." Cain held up a hand to silence him, his gaze never leaving Esther's. "Now that ain't very neighbourly, ma'am. We're not asking for much. Just a little hospitality." He took a step forward. It was the signal. The moment the negotiation ended and the war began. With a speed that belied her grief-weary body, Esther brought the shotgun up to her shoulder, the smooth wood of the stock fitting into the familiar hollow. The twin barrels, dark and menacing, were now aimed squarely at Jedediah Cain's chest. The transformation was instantaneous. The air crackled with a new deadly electricity. Cain froze his hand, hovering over the Colt Peacemaker, strapped to his hip. The other men who had been lazily sitting their horses now sat bolt upright, their hands moving instinctively towards their own weapons. "I said," Esther repeated, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that seemed to dredge up every ounce of pain and loss she had endured. "Get off my land." For a heart-stopping moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the snorting of the horses and the whisper of the wind through the prairie grass. Cain's eyes narrowed, searching her face, looking for the telltale flicker of fear, of doubt. He found none. He found only the cold, hard certainty of a woman with nothing left to lose. He had miscalculated. He had seen a lonely widow, a prize ripe for the taking. He had not seen the fury of a saint pushed to the edge. "You're making a big mistake, lady." Cain snarled, his hand inching closer to his gun. "No," Esther said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "You already made yours." The world exploded in a deafening roar of fire and smoke. Esther didn't aim for Cain. That would have been too easy, too clean. Josiah had taught her that the first shot was about the message, not the man. She fired into the dust at his feet, the buckshot kicking up a vicious cloud of dirt and rock that peppered his legs and sent him stumbling back with a yelp of surprise and pain. The second barrel she discharged into the air, a thunderous declaration of war that sent the horses into a frenzy. Chaos erupted. The riders fought to control their spooked mounts, their carefully constructed facade of intimidation shattered. The wiry man with the shifty eyes managed to draw his pistol, firing a wild shot that splintered the porch railing to Esther's left. But he was too slow, too panicked. Esther had already ducked back into the cabin, slamming the heavy oak door shut and dropping the thick iron bar into place. She moved through the small, familiar space with the fluid grace of a predator in its den. She reloaded the shotgun, her hands working with practiced efficiency. Her mind a maelstrom of calculated fury. They would come for her now. They would try to burn her out, to break down the door. She had bought herself time, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Outside, Cain's voice, now raw with rage, cut through the panicked whinnying of the horses. "You crazy witch! You're gonna pay for that! Burn it, burn the whole damn place to the ground!" Esther peered through a small crack in the window shutter. Two of the men were dismounting, pulling out torches they had fashioned from oil-soaked rags. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The cabin was her sanctuary, the last tangible piece of her life with Josiah. The thought of it being consumed by flames was more terrifying than any bullet. She rested the barrel of the shotgun on the windowsill, took a deep breath, and aimed. This time there was no warning shot. The blast tore through the twilight, and one of the men with a torch screamed, clutching his shoulder as he crumpled to the ground. The other man dropped his torch and scrambled for cover. A standoff. They had guns and she had a fortress. But they had numbers and time. She had 2 shells left and a dwindling supply of courage. The sun had bled out on the horizon, plunging the prairie into a deep, inky darkness that was broken only by the sliver of a crescent moon. The silence returned thicker and more menacing than before. They were out there waiting, plotting. Hours crawled by. Every creak of the cabin walls, every rustle of the wind sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her. She sat in Josiah's rocking chair, the shotgun across her lap. Her senses strained to their breaking point. The grief that had been her constant companion had been replaced by a white-hot rage, a primal instinct to survive. It was close to midnight when she heard it. A new sound, distinct from the wind, the slow, tired plod of a single horse. Her body went rigid. Had one of them circled around? Was this a new tactic? A fresh assault? She crept back to the window, her knuckles white as she gripped the shotgun. Through the crack, she saw a lone rider approaching not from the east, where Cain and his men were hidden, but from the west, from the direction of the mountains. The rider was slumped in the saddle, swaying with the horse's gentle rhythm. As he drew closer into the faint moonlight, she could see that he was young, barely a man, and his clothes were dark, with what looked like blood. Her finger rested on the trigger. This could be a trick, a ruse to get her to open the door. The West was full of stories of such deceptions, but something held her back. The way he slumped in the saddle, the exhausted slump of his shoulders, it wasn't the posture of a predator. It was the posture of the prey. The horse, a magnificent black stallion, stopped right in front of her porch, as if it knew this was its destination. The young man moaned a soft, guttural sound of pure agony, and then he slid from the saddle, collapsing in a heap in the dust not 10 feet from her door. Esther's heart was a war drum in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to wait for the morning. But the sound of his pain, the sheer vulnerability of his crumpled form, pricked at a part of her she thought had died with Josiah, the part that was a healer, a nurturer. Before she had been a wife and a homesteader, she had been a nurse. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted the iron bar. The creak of the door was deafening in the silence. She stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun still held at the ready, its barrels pointed at the unmoving figure on the ground. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice a harsh whisper. The man stirred, pushing himself up onto one elbow. The moonlight caught his face pale and strained his features handsome despite the grime and blood. His eyes dark and filled with a universe of pain found hers. He opened his mouth, his lips cracked and dry. He spoke a single word, a word that shattered the foundations of Esther's world, a word that was impossible, a word that stole the breath from her lungs and the strength from her limbs. "Ma." The shotgun slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the wooden planks of the porch, with a sound that echoed the breaking of her own heart. The man on the ground was a stranger, his face unfamiliar, his voice a ghost from a life she had buried long ago. But the name he had called her, it was the name only one person had ever used: her son. Her little boy, Thomas, who had been taken from her by a fever 20 years ago, 1,000 miles away in Ohio, and buried in a small churchyard, she could no longer picture. This was a cruel trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by fear and grief. It had to be. But as the stranger's eyes fluttered closed and he collapsed back into the dust, the last word he had spoken hung in the air, a phantom whisper that clawed at the walls she had built around her heart. "Ma!" The world tilted on its axis. Esther stood frozen on the porch, the cold night air doing little to quell the firestorm in her mind. Ma. The word was a key, unlocking a room in her heart she had sealed shut for 2 decades. A room filled with the phantom weight of a small hand in hers, the echo of a child's laughter, the unbearable ache of a love that had nowhere to go. Her son Thomas had been a wisp of a boy, all knobby knees and bright, curious eyes. He had died at the age of 5, his small body consumed by a fever that had swept through their Ohio town like a prairie fire. She had held him, sung to him, and felt the last fluttering breath leave his body. She had picked out the wood for his tiny casket. She had watched as Josiah shoveled the cold, dark earth over it. Thomas was gone. He was a memory, a ghost she carried in the locket around her neck. And yet, the man on the ground, bleeding into the dust of her front yard, had spoken the name. The primal instincts of a mother, long dormant, warred with the hardened survival instincts of a widow. To bring him inside was madness. Cain and his men were still out there, lurking in the darkness. This stranger could be one of them, a part of an elaborate and cruel deception. But to leave him out here to die... She looked at his pale, blood-streaked face, and she saw not a threat but a binhamu, for in desperate need of his mother. With a choked sob that was equal parts terror and a strange, burgeoning hope, she made her decision. Dragging him was a monumental effort. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked her arms under his, her boots, slipping in the loose dirt, and pulled him inch by agonizing inch across the yard and up onto the porch. The effort left her gasping for breath, her muscles screaming in protest. She hauled him inside, bolted the door, and for a moment simply leaned against it, her body trembling, her mind reeling. By the flickering light of her lantern, she got her first good look at him. He was older than she first thought, perhaps 25, the same age Thomas would have been. A thick stubble covered his jaw, but it couldn't hide the clean lines of his face. A nasty gash on his forehead was the source of much of the blood, but as she carefully, gently began to peel away his torn and bloody shirt, she found the real source of his trouble. A bullet wound low on his right side, angry and inflamed. Esther, the widow, receded, and Esther, the nurse, took over. She moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in months, fetching her medical supplies, a small but well-stocked box Josiah had insisted they keep. She tore strips from a clean linen sheet, boiled water, and laid out her needle and thread. As she worked, cleaning the wound with whiskey, a move that caused the unconscious man to groan and arch his back, she studied his face. Was there a hint of Josiah in the set of his jaw? A shadow of her own father in the curve of his brow? She was desperate to find a connection, a piece of a puzzle that made no sense. She found nothing. He was a stranger. She probed the wound gently with a pair of sterilized tweezers, her touch deft and sure. The bullet was lodged deep. Getting it out would be painful and dangerous, but leaving it in would be a death sentence. She steeled herself, took a deep breath, and began the delicate, bloody work. He woke as she was stitching the wound closed. His eyes, the color of dark, rich soil, flew open wide with panic and pain. He tried to sit up, a strangled cry escaping his lips. "Easy now," Esther said, her voice soft but firm, her hand gently pushing him back down. "Lie still. You've lost a lot of blood." He stared at her, his eyes clouded with confusion. Where am I?" "You're safe," she said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "You collapsed outside my cabin. You've been shot." He looked down at his bandaged side, then back at her. The panic in his eyes slowly faded, replaced by a dawning recognition. "I remember. Riding. I was looking for someone." His gaze sharpened, focusing on her face, on the locket that rested in the hollow of her throat. "I found you." Esther's heart skipped a beat. "What's your name, son?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Leo," he said. "Leo Vance." The name meant nothing to her. Not Vance, not Leo. It was just another brick in the wall of her confusion. "Leo," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "Why did you call me Ma?" Leo's brow furrowed, a flicker of a memory, or perhaps a dream, passing through his eyes. I don't know," he admitted, his voice hoarse. It felt right. When I saw you standing on the porch, it was like I was coming home." He coughed, a racking sound that shook his whole body. "I have something for you," he rasped, fumbling with a small leather pouch tied to his belt. It's why I came." With trembling fingers, he untied the pouch and emptied its contents into his palm. It wasn't gold or jewels. It was a single small, tarnished silver button. It was intricately carved with a tiny, stylized bird, a finch in the center. The breath left Esther's body in a rush, as if she'd been punched. The world swam before her eyes. She reached out a trembling hand and took the button. She didn't need to examine it. She knew every curve, every line. It was from a small dress coat she had sewn for Thomas for his 5th birthday, a coat he had been buried in. One of the buttons had come loose just before the funeral. She had thought it lost forever. "Where?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Did you get this?" "My mother gave it to me," Leo said, his eyes beginning to droop with exhaustion. She told me if I ever needed to find my real family, to follow the setting sun and find the woman with my father's eyes. She said the button would prove who I was." He struggled to keep his eyes open. "She died 2 months ago. She made me promise." The room was spinning. Esther's mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible. Thomas had died. She had seen it. But this boy, this stranger named Leo, had the button. He spoke of a mother who had raised him of her father's eyes. Her father had the same stormy grey eyes that now stared back at her from her own reflection. "Your mother," Esther said, her voice shaking. "What was her name?" "Sarah," Leo murmured, his voice fading. "Sarah Vance. She was a nurse back in Ohio." The name hit Esther like a physical blow. Sarah Vance, a young, pretty nurse who had worked in the same clinic where Esther had volunteered. A nurse who had been there the night Thomas died. a nurse who had quietly left town a week later with no word to anyone. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture so monstrous, so heartbreaking that Esther could barely comprehend it. The fever, the chaos in the clinic, the small, still form she had been given to bury. Had it all been a lie? A cruel, unimaginable deception? Could it be possible that her son had not died? That he had been stolen from her, and another child, a victim of the same fever, had been placed in his casket? The idea was insane, the stuff of penny dreadfuls, but the button in her hand was real. The boy in her cabin was real, and the story in his eyes felt terrifyingly, impossibly true. Before she could ask another question, before she could voice the storm of hope and rage that was tearing her apart, Leo's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. Esther was left alone in the silent cabin, the ghost of her past lying wounded on her floor, and the wolves still waiting outside her door. The night was far from over, and she now had more to protect than just a piece of land. She had to protect a flicker of impossible hope, a hope that could either redeem her past or destroy her future. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the prairie in hues of soft pink and grey. The light brought no comfort to Esther. It only served to illuminate the precariousness of her situation. Outside, a gang of ruthless men wanted her dead. Inside, a man who claimed to be the son she had buried 20 years ago lay hovering between life and death. She had spent the remainder of the night in a state of hypervigilance, tending to Leo's fever, which had begun to climb, while her ears strained for any sound from Cain and his men. The silence from their camp was unnerving. It wasn't the silence of retreat. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Leo tossed and turned in a fevered delirium, murmuring names and places that meant nothing to Esther. Blackwood. The papers. Have to warn him. Cain. The name jolted her. Cain. He had said Cain. Not just any Cain, but the name of the man who was currently laying siege to her home. A cold dread washed over her. This was no coincidence. The arrival of Leo and the attack by Jedediah Cain were connected. But how? She needed answers, and the only person who had them was unconscious. As she gently wiped his brow with a cool, damp cloth, her eyes fell upon the leather saddlebags he had been carrying, which she had brought inside and placed in a corner. Her conscience pricked at her. To go through a man's personal belongings was a violation, a betrayal of trust. But her need to understand, to protect them both, outweighed any sense of propriety. With hesitant fingers, she unbuckled the worn leather straps. Inside, she found a change of clothes, a half-eaten loaf of bread, and a small leather-bound journal. Her heart pounded as she opened it. The handwriting was neat and precise, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence that had brought him to her door. The journal was filled with entries detailing his journey from a small town in Wyoming. He wrote of his adoptive mother's recent death, of the confession she had made on her deathbed, that he was not her son, but the child of a woman named Esther Hayes, and that she, Sarah Vance, had stolen him as a baby from a clinic in Ohio. Sarah had been a desperate, childless woman who, in a moment of grief-stricken madness, had swapped the living, healthy Thomas with another infant who had succumbed to the fever. She had fled raising Leo as her own, always haunted by her crime. Tears streamed down Esther's face as she read the words, each one a confirmation of the impossible truth that had begun to bloom in her heart. Her son was alive. Her Thomas. This boy, Leo. But as she read on, the story took a darker, more complex turn. In the last few entries, Leo wrote of a discovery he had made while going through his adoptive mother's papers. Sarah, it seemed, had not been just a simple nurse. She had kept meticulous records, including letters she had exchanged over the years with a man named Silas Kane, Jedediah Kane's older, more powerful brother. According to the journal, Silas Kane was a wealthy and influential land baron who was systematically driving small homesteaders out of the territory, using his brother Jedediah's gang as his enforcers. Silas's goal was to acquire vast tracts of land that were rumored to be rich with silver deposits, land the railroad was planning to cross. And the key to it all, the linchpin of his entire scheme, was a set of forged deeds and falsified geological surveys. And Sarah Vance, the woman who had stolen Esther's son, had been Silas Kane's secret accomplice. She had been the one to create the forged documents using her skills in calligraphy and her knowledge of legal paperwork. She had been paid handsomely for her work, a payment that had allowed her to disappear from Ohio and start a new life. But Sarah, in her final years, had been consumed by guilt not just for stealing Leo, but for her role in Silas Kane's criminal enterprise. Before she died, she had given Leo a packet of letters and a map. The letters were from Silas, implicating him in the scheme. The map detailed the location of the real deeds and surveys which were hidden in a safe in the land office in Blackwood Creek. Sarah had urged Leo to find his real mother, to give her the button as proof of his identity, and then to take the evidence against Silas Kane to the territorial marshal in Helena. It was all there, in black and white. Leo had been on his way to find her, to enlist her help, when he must have been ambushed by Jedediah's gang. They weren't after a random homestead. They were after Leo. They were after the evidence that could destroy Silas Kane. And now they thought she had it. A sudden sharp crack from outside snapped her out of her horrified trance. It was the sound of splintering wood. They were starting their assault. She scrambled to the window, peering through the crack. Two of Kane's men were using a heavy log as a battering ram against the front door. The thick oak shuddered with each impact. She had to think. She was no longer just defending her home. She was defending her son, and the evidence that could bring justice to this lawless land. Her eyes darted around the small cabin, searching for a solution, a way out. They fell upon Josiah's old hunting rifle, a long-range Sharps that he had used for hunting buffalo in his younger days. It was a powerful, accurate weapon, but slow to reload. An idea desperate and dangerous began to form in her mind. She couldn't fight them head-on. She had to outsmart them. She dragged a heavy wooden table and wedged it against the door, reinforcing it. Then she moved to the back of the cabin, to the small window that overlooked the endless prairie. She grabbed a spare blanket and one of her own dresses. Working quickly, she stuffed the dress with straw from her mattress, creating a crude, life-size decoy. She propped it up in the rocking chair, facing the back window, the Sharps rifle resting on its lap. From a distance in the dim light, it might just look like a person standing guard. It was a long shot, a gambler's play. But it was the only play she had. With her shotgun in hand, she climbed the small ladder that led to the cabin's loft. It was cramped and dusty, filled with stored supplies and old memories. But it had one crucial advantage: a small ventilation hatch on the roof, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. The battering ram slammed against the door again, the wood groaning in protest. She had moments at best. With her heart in her throat, she pushed open the hatch and crawled out onto the roof, the rough-hewn shingles digging into her palms. The morning air was cool and crisp. She lay flat, her body pressed against the roofline, her shotgun by her side. She had a clear view of the front of the cabin, of the men relentlessly attacking her door. They were so focused on their task, so certain of their victory, that they never thought to look up. The door finally gave way with a sickening crunch, splintering inwards. Kane and his men let out a triumphant roar, surging into the cabin. "Find her!" Kane bellowed, "and find the bag!" Esther held her breath, waiting. She heard them crashing around below, overturning furniture, their voices a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "She's not here!" one of them yelled. "The back window's open." "There!" another shouted. "In the chair! Don't move, witch!" A shot rang out from inside the cabin. They had fired at the decoy. It was the moment she had been waiting for, the ultimate miscalculation. While they were distracted, she rose to her knees. She was Esther Hayes, a widow, a mother, a force of nature. And this was her land. "Looking for me, boys?" She called out, her voice ringing out in the morning air, clear and cold as a funeral bell. 6 heads whipped around their faces, a comical mask of shock and disbelief as they stared up at the figure on the roof. They had been so sure she was trapped, cornered. They had walked into her trap. Jedediah Kane's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "Get her!" he screamed, raising his pistol. But Esther was faster. She had the high ground. She had the element of surprise, and she had a righteous fury that had been simmering for 20 years. The shotgun bucked against her shoulder, its roar a deafening exclamation point to her declaration of ownership. One of the men closest to the cabin crumpled to the ground, his chest a crimson flower. The battle for the soul of the prairie had begun, and the widow on the roof had just fired the first shot. The world dissolved into a cacophony of cordite screams and shouting. Kane's men, their moment of triumph turned to ash in their mouths, scrambled for the dubious cover of the porch railings and the open doorway. They were thugs and bullies, their courage born of numbers, and the fear they inspired in others, not from any true grit. Faced with a determined, elevated foe, their attack devolved into a panicked, disorganized retreat. Esther worked the shotgun with a deadly mechanical rhythm that belied the frantic beating of her heart. Fire, break, eject, reload, fire. Each blast was a punctuation mark in a story of long overdue vengeance. She was no longer just fighting for a piece of land. She was fighting for the life that had been stolen from her, for the son who lay wounded and helpless below his fate, tied inextricably to hers. A second raider trying to flee toward the tethered horses screamed and went down, clutching a leg shredded by buckshot. He writhed in the dust, his cries a stark testament to Esther's fury. "Spread out, you fools!" Kane roared, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and desperation. He was a better tactician than his brutish men, and he quickly grasped the suicidal folly of being clustered together. He and the remaining 3 able-bodied men scattered diving behind the sparse cover of a water trough, a cluster of rocks, and the grim shield of a fallen comrade's body. The nature of the fight changed instantly. The advantage of surprise was gone. Now it was a battle of attrition. Bullets began to whistle past Esther, thudding into the roof shingles with vicious cracks and sending splinters flying past her face. She pressed herself flat against the incline of the roof, the rough wood digging into her cheek, her breath coming in ragged gasps. A lead ball tore through the peak of the roof just inches above her head, the sound a sharp, terrifying zip. She was pinned. Her shotgun, so devastating at close range, was a poor tool against scattered targets who were now taking careful aim. From inside the cabin, A weak, pain-filled cry cut through the din of gunfire. "Ma, Leo!" The sound his voice calling for her sent a jolt of ice-cold fear through her battle rage. He was awake, conscious of the war being waged for his life, just a few feet away. She had to end this. Quickly. "Leo!" She yelled, her voice raw and strained, nearly lost in the echo of a pistol shot. "Can you hear me?" A pause filled only by the crackle of gunfire. Then a muffled "yes" from within. He sounded weak, but he was there. The rifle Josiah's sharps by the back window. "Can you get to it?" The question was an impossible ask. He was grievously wounded, but it was their only hope. The silence that followed was an agony. She heard a drawn-out groan of pure effort, the sound of something heavy scraping across the wooden floor. He was trying. The thought of him dragging his wounded body across the cabin floor for her, for them, fueled her resolve. She had to buy him time. She risked a glance over the roofline. Kane and his men were advancing, emboldened by her silence. They were moving from cover to cover, their shots becoming more coordinated, more accurate. She fired her left barrel, the buckshot spraying harmlessly against the rocks where one of the men was hiding. But it was enough to make him duck back down. "Push it up to me," she commanded, screaming towards the hatch, through the loft hatch. It was the most agonizing wait of her life. Every second stretched into an eternity. Bullets chewed at the wood around her, a constant deadly percussion. She kept firing the shotgun, not aiming to hit, but simply to make them keep their heads down, to give Leo the precious, vital seconds he needed. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, her supply of shells dwindling. Then she saw it. First the tip, then the long, heavy octagonal barrel of the Sharps rifle, rising slowly, painstakingly through the hatch. It wavered, then dipped, followed by a cry of pain from below. He was faltering. Almost there. "Leo, hold on," she cried, her voice a plea. With what must have been his last ounce of strength, he gave one final push. The rifle cleared the hatch, and she scrambled over, grabbing it. Her fingers closing around the cool, familiar steel and worn wood. It was a heavy, unwieldy weapon, but in that moment it felt like an extension of her own will, a conduit for her soul's righteous anger. She slid a single heavy-caliber cartridge, long as her thumb, into the breech, the solid clack of the closing block, a sound of finality. This was a different kind of weapon, a different kind of fighting. The shotgun was for chaos. The Sharps was for judgment. She settled the brass butt plate against her shoulder, took a deep, steadying breath to still her trembling hands, and peered through the sights. The world narrowed to that small, steel-framed aperture. She scanned the landscape, her eyes sweeping past the bodies of the fallen, seeking out her targets. She saw one of them, the wiry man with the shifty eyes who had mocked her earlier, peering out from behind a large boulder. He was reloading his pistol, preparing to make a run for a better angle. Esther tracked his movement, leading him just slightly, just as Josiah had taught her. She exhaled slowly, her finger tightening on the trigger. The world went silent. The Sharps rifle boomed a deep, resonant roar that was vastly different from the shotgun's scattershot blast. It was the voice of thunder. Across the prairie, the wiry man's head snapped back as if pulled by an invisible string. A red mist bloomed in the air behind him, and he fell, his body limp and boneless, his run cut short before it had even begun. A stunned, profound silence fell over the battlefield. The power and raw accuracy of the shot had a sobering, terrifying effect on the remaining men. This wasn't some lucky blast from a scattergun. This was the work of a skilled, cold-blooded marksman. "Jed," one of the men yelled from behind the water trough, his voice laced with pure panic. "This ain't worth it. That's a buffalo gun. She can pick us off from here." "Shut up and keep firing," Kane snarled, but the confidence in his own voice had been shattered. He was a wolf, but he had just run into a grizzly bear who had claimed this territory as her own. Esther reloaded her movements, sure and steady, now the adrenaline honing her focus to a razor's edge. They were pinned. They knew it. Their only hope was to wait her out, to wait for darkness. But she wasn't going to give them that chance. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension, overwhelming the prairie silence. The thunder of hoofbeats coming fast from the west, from the direction of the mountains. But it wasn't just one horse. It was many. A dozen, maybe more. A posse. The martial hope, fierce and blindingly bright, surged in Esther's chest. Kane and his remaining men heard it too. Their faces turned, their expressions shifting from aggression to raw alarm. They had been so focused on the cabin, so consumed by their fight with her, that they had let themselves be caught in a trap of their own making. But as the riders crested a small rise, silhouetted against the morning sun, Esther's hope turned to jagged ice in her veins. They weren't lawmen. Their movements were too fluid, too predatory. They were another gang of outlaws riding hard and with purpose. And at their lead was a man on a powerful grey stallion, a man who sat tall and straight in the saddle, his face a mask of cold, calculating intelligence. He was older than Jedediah, dressed in a fine, tailored black coat that seemed to absorb the light around it, a stark contrast to the dusty, sweat-stained rags of his men. Even from this distance, Esther could feel the aura of absolute, unshakable authority that radiated from him. It was Silas Kane. Jedediah's face, which had been pale with fear, broke into a wide grin of relief and renewed arrogance. "Right on time, brother," he yelled, waving his hat. Silas Kane paid him no mind. His cold, assessing eyes swept across the scene, taking in every detail. In an instant, the two dead raiders, the third wounded, and whimpering the splintered door of the cabin, and finally, the lone figure of the woman on the roof, her small frame made formidable by the long rifle she held. He raised a single gloved hand. His men reined in their horses as one, a silent, disciplined, and far more dangerous force than his brother's rabble. "Jedediah," Silas said, his voice calm, yet carrying across the distance with an unnerving clarity that cut through the wind. "Your instructions were to retrieve a package and its courier. You were not, as I recall, instructed to start a war with a farmer's wife and lose half your men in the process." "She ain't just some farmer's wife, Silas," Jedediah protested, gesturing wildly at the carnage around him. "She's a devil, and the boy, the courier, he's in there. I heard him." Silas's gaze shifted to the cabin, his eyes narrowing to slits. "So the whelp made it this far," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. His chilling eyes returned to Esther. A flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps just cold amusement, crossed his features. "You have proven to be a formidable adversary, madam. I can appreciate that. But this is the end of the game. You have in your possession a satchel of documents that belong to me, and you are harboring a fugitive wanted for theft. Hand them both over, and I will be merciful. I will allow you to live." It was not a negotiation. It was a death sentence, merely delayed. Esther knew it with every fiber of her being. She had read Leo's journal. She and her son were the only living witnesses who could link Silas Kane to his vast criminal enterprise. He would never, could never let them live. "The only thing I have for you," Esther called back, her voice ringing with a defiance she did not feel, but willed into existence, "is a reckoning. For every family you've ruined, for every life you've destroyed, and for my son." A slow, cold smile spread across Silas Kane's face, a smile that did not reach his dead eyes. "So be it." He turned his head slightly, his command delivered in that same calm tone that was more terrifying than any shout. "Burn it," he commanded, "and kill anyone who comes out." This time there was no hesitation. The newly arrived men dismounted with practiced efficiency, pulling out torches and rifles. They were a disciplined, ruthless force, and they advanced on the small pine cabin with a deadly, inexorable purpose. The final battle had begun. Esther was outnumbered, more than 10 to 1, outgunned, and her only ally was a wounded boy inside a wooden tinderbox. The odds were not just long. They were impossible. But as she looked down at the men advancing on her home on her son, she felt no fear, only a cold, crystalline certainty. If this was to be her end, she would make it an end that the Montana Territory would never forget. She raised the Sharps rifle to her shoulder one last time, rested her cheek against the stock, and took aim at the man in the black coat, the fate of her past and her future resting on a single, desperate, impossible shot. The story of Esther Hayes and the Battle of Dust Devil Gulch, as it came to be known, became a cornerstone of Montana legend. It wasn't just a tale of survival. It was a testament to the indomitable will of a mother and the surprising turns of fate. Esther's desperate stand bought them the one thing the Kane's money couldn't time. Her final impossible shot from the roof didn't kill Silas Kane, but it struck his horse, sending the powerful man tumbling into the dust and disarray, just as the distant cloud on the horizon resolved into the territorial marshals, alerted by a rancher who'd seen the smoke. The evidence in Leo's satchel, combined with the testimony of a captured and repentant Jedediah, was enough to unravel Silas Kane's empire of greed and fear. Esther Hayes, the quiet widow, became the woman who broke the back of the most powerful criminal in the territory. She and Leo rebuilt the cabin, their shared ordeal, forging a bond deeper than blood, a slow, careful healing of wounds, 20 years in the making. Their story reminds us that in the heart of the great wild frontier, the fiercest force of nature isn't the storm or the fire, but the unyielding power of a mother's love. If this story of grit and redemption stirred your soul, help us keep these legends alive. Hit that like button. Share this tale with someone who loves a classic Western, and be sure to subscribe for more stories from the untamed heart of history. Your support allows us to continue unearthing the incredible true dramas of the American West. Let us know in the comments which legend you want to hear next.